My name is Vanessa Torres, and I stood in front of Austin's newest skyscraper with a bottle of champagne in one hand and my mother's trembling hand in the other while my father screamed from behind security gates that I'd stolen his legacy. The building's glass facade reflected the sunset, and etched across the top in letters 3 feet tall was a name he'd spent 30 years trying to erase: Torres Memorial Tower. He said I'd crumble without his money, his connections, his name. He was wrong about everything except one thing. I did crumble. But I rebuilt myself into something he could never tear down. Have you ever been told you're nothing without someone, only to discover they were the weight holding you back all along? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The air conditioning in my beat-up Honda rattled as I pulled into the visitor parking lot of Torres Development Group headquarters. It was June, the kind of Texas heat that made asphalt shimmer like water, and my interview suit clung to my back despite the cold air blasting from the vents. In the passenger seat sat my portfolio, 5 years of architectural designs bound in faux leather, edges worn from being carried to firm after firm across Austin. This was my 23rd interview in 4 months. The difference was that this time, the person across the table would be my father. I'd rehearsed what I'd say during the entire drive from my studio apartment in East Austin. Professional. Confident. Focused on the work, not the history. My reflection in the rearview mirror showed dark circles under my eyes from another sleepless night, but I'd covered them well enough. The building loomed ahead, 40 stories of steel and reflective glass that Vanessa Torres had built from the ground up, starting with a single-strip mall renovation 30 years ago. Every real estate developer in Texas knew his name. Every architecture student studied his projects. And every time someone asked if I was related to that Torres, I'd learned to smile and change the subject. The lobby smelled like expensive marble and fresh flowers. A receptionist with perfect posture glanced at my worn heels and directed me to the executive floor with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. The elevator climbed in silence, my stomach dropping with each passing floor. At 22, I'd left home with nothing but my acceptance letter to the University of Texas architecture program and a promise from my mother whispered in the dark: follow your dreams, even if they terrify him. I hadn't spoken to my father since. 5 years of radio silence, punctuated only by messages from my mother delivered in hushed phone calls when he was out of town. She'd tell me about his latest projects, his expanding empire, the penthouse office with views of Lady Bird Lake. She never mentioned whether he asked about me. I stopped wondering after the first year. The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area larger than my entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased downtown Austin sprawling beneath us. A woman in a tailored navy suit approached, clipboard in hand, expression neutral. She introduced herself as Patricia, his executive assistant for the past decade. She didn't ask if I was nervous. She simply gestured toward a conference room and said he was running 15 minutes behind, as if lateness were a power move he'd perfected into an art form. I waited in a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly rent, portfolio open on the glass table, trying not to touch anything that might leave fingerprints. Through the window, construction cranes dotted the skyline. Austin was booming. Tech companies were flooding in, condos were rising where dive bars used to stand, and real estate was the new gold rush. My father was at the center of it all, brokering deals, flipping properties, building towers that changed the city's silhouette. And I was sitting in his conference room with a degree he'd called a waste of time and designs he'd never seen. The door opened without warning. Vanessa Torres walked in wearing a suit that cost more than my car, silver threading through his dark hair, posture radiating the kind of authority that came from never being told no. He didn't look at me right away. He set down his phone, adjusted his cufflinks, and poured himself water from a crystal pitcher. Only then did his eyes meet mine, and in that split second, I saw something flicker across his face. Not warmth. Not pride. Just calculation, like I was a property he was considering whether to acquire or demolish. He sat across from me and opened my portfolio without greeting, without asking how I'd been, without acknowledging that we hadn't spoken in 5 years. His fingers moved across the pages with the efficiency of someone who reviewed dozens of proposals daily. My sustainable housing project. My adaptive reuse concept for historic buildings. My thesis on affordable urban density. He studied each one in silence, expression unreadable, until he closed the portfolio with a soft thud that echoed in the quiet room. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the same cold precision I remembered from childhood dinner tables where silence was safer than conversation. He said my designs were idealistic. Impractical. The kind of thing professors praised and investors laughed at. He said sustainable architecture was a buzzword for people who didn't understand profit margins. He said affordable housing was a political talking point, not a business model. And then he said the words that would loop in my mind for the next 3 years. You have talent, Vanessa, but talent without capital is just expensive daydreaming. You want to build? You'll do it my way, or you won't do it at all. I asked what he meant. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a contract for an entry-level position in his acquisitions department. Not architecture. Not design. Just site surveys, zoning research, and paperwork for projects other people would create. The salary was barely above minimum wage. The title had the word assistant in it twice. And at the bottom, in small print, was a clause stating that any intellectual property developed during employment belonged exclusively to Torres Development Group. He watched me read it, waiting for gratitude that never came. I asked about the architecture division. He said they didn't hire recent graduates with no commercial experience. I mentioned my internship at Reyes and Associates, a small but respected firm where I'd spent 2 years learning from Elena Reyes, one of the few Latina architects who'd broken through Austin's old money development scene. He waved it off. Boutique firms didn't count. Real development required scale, speed, and the stomach to make decisions that kept buildings profitable, not pretty. I looked down at the contract again, at the clause that would sign away anything I created. I thought about my studio apartment with its leaking faucet and flickering lights. I thought about my student loans growing interest like weeds. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone last week, tired and careful, saying your father heard you graduated summa cum laude. He didn't say it, but I think he's proud. I thought about 5 years of proving I could survive without his money, his name, his approval. And then I thought about what signing that paper would mean. It would mean he was right. It would mean I needed him. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. I told him I appreciated the offer, but I was looking for a position where I could practice architecture, not process paperwork. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. He asked if I understood how competitive the industry was. If I knew how many graduates were working retail jobs because they'd been too proud to start at the bottom. If I realized that walking out of his office meant walking away from the only real opportunity I'd get in this city. I stood up. My hands were shaking, but I kept my voice steady. I told him I'd rather build one meaningful project on my own than spend a career erasing my name from someone else's work. He stood too, buttoning his suit jacket with the kind of deliberate slowness that made it clear he was done with the conversation. He said I'd be back. That reality would humble me faster than he ever could. That when I came crawling back, the offer would be half as generous, if it existed at all. I picked up my portfolio and walked toward the door. His voice stopped me just as my hand touched the handle. He said one more thing, low and cold enough that I almost didn't hear it. He said, your mother thinks you're special, but she always saw the world through rose-colored glasses. You're just another dreamer in a city full of them. The difference is, they don't carry my last name while embarrassing me. I didn't turn around. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing my face. I walked out of that conference room, past Patricia's carefully neutral expression, into the elevator that felt smaller on the way down. The lobby's expensive air hit me like a wall, and I made it to my car before the tears came. Not sad tears. Angry ones. The kind that burn because they're mixed with something sharper than grief. They were mixed with determination. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, watching employees filter in and out of the building, all of them wearing confidence like armor. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. How did it go? I stared at the message, thumbs hovering over the keyboard. I could tell her the truth. I could tell her that her husband had offered me a job designed to break my spirit and that I'd walked away from the only safety net I'd ever get. Or I could protect her from the choice she'd have to make between supporting me and keeping peace in a house that had never known much of it. I typed, "It didn't work out, but I'm okay." She responded immediately, "Come home for dinner. We'll talk." I knew what that meant. My father would be there. She'd try to mediate. He'd make it clear that my presence was conditional on my obedience. And I'd spend the entire evening suffocating under the weight of everything left unsaid. I texted back, "Not tonight. Love you." Then I turned off my phone and drove. I didn't go home. I drove to the east side, where my mother grew up, where palaterias still stood on corners and murals covered warehouse walls. The neighborhood was changing. Coffee shops with minimalist logos were replacing taquerias. New apartment complexes advertised luxury living in areas that had been redlined for decades. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My mother's childhood street was barely recognizable. The small house where she'd been raised had been demolished, replaced by a sleek townhome with a Tesla in the driveway. Progress, my father would call it. Erasure, she'd whisper when he wasn't listening. I parked in front of what used to be a corner store and stared at the empty lot beside it. Weeds pushed through cracked concrete. A faded for sale sign leaned against a chain-link fence. And in my mind, unbidden and impossible, I saw something else. I saw a building. Not a luxury tower. Not a generic glass box. Something different. Something that belonged to the neighborhood instead of colonizing it. Affordable units with courtyards. Retail space for local businesses. Green roofs and solar panels. A structure that proved sustainable design could be profitable if you cared more about longevity than quarterly earnings. It was a fantasy. I had $1,200 in my checking account and a car that needed new brakes. But sitting there in the heat, watching the sun sink behind buildings my father had probably financed, I made a decision. I didn't need his approval. I didn't need his money. I didn't even need his last name. What I needed was to prove that the world he'd built wasn't the only world possible. I pulled out my phone and called the one person who'd always believed I could do more than survive his shadow. Elena Reyes answered on the second ring, and before she could say hello, I asked her a question that would change everything. I asked if she still had that list of investors who cared more about legacy than profit. She was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed. It wasn't a dismissive laugh. It was the kind that comes from recognizing a younger version of yourself making the same reckless choice you'd once made. She said, "You walked out, didn't you?" I said yes. She said good, and then she told me to meet her at her office first thing Monday morning because she had a story to tell me about the first time she'd told a powerful man no. I thanked her and hung up, and for the first time since I'd left my father's office, I felt something other than anger. I felt possibility. The drive home took me past Lady Bird Lake, where kayakers glided across water turned gold by the setting sun. Austin was beautiful in that particular way that made people fall in love with it, that made them ignore how expensive it had become, how many families had been pushed out to make room for people who could afford the view. My father had been part of that transformation. He'd bought low and sold high and called it business. My mother had watched from the passenger seat of his success, silent and smiling, while the city she'd grown up in became unrecognizable. I thought about her sitting in that Westlake Hills mansion, surrounded by furniture she hadn't chosen and art she didn't like, hosting parties for people who saw her as an accessory to my father's brand. I thought about the way she'd whisper encouragement during our phone calls, always checking to make sure he wasn't listening. I thought about the sketches I'd shown her as a kid, buildings drawn on napkins and notebook margins, and how she'd save every single one in a box she kept hidden in her closet. My father had thrown them away once when he found them. She'd retrieved them from the trash after he left for work. She'd never said it outright, but I knew. She'd given up her dreams so he could chase his. She'd been an art teacher before they married, passionate about color and form and helping kids see beauty in ordinary things. He'd convinced her to quit after the wedding. Said it didn't make sense for her to work when he was building an empire. Said she could always go back later. Later never came. The years stacked up, and somewhere in that house full of expensive emptiness, the woman who'd painted murals and taught children about perspective had disappeared into someone whose only role was to make him look good. I wouldn't let that happen to me. I wouldn't spend decades waiting for permission to exist. If my father wanted to believe I'd fail without him, then I'd prove him wrong in the most permanent way possible. I'd build something that couldn't be ignored. Something that would stand long after his 40-story monuments to ego started showing cracks. Something with her name on it, not his. My apartment was dark when I got home. The neighbor's dog was barking again, and someone was playing bass-heavy music that rattled my windows. I dropped my portfolio on the second-hand couch and opened my laptop. The screen's glow illuminated stacks of library books on urban planning, sustainable design, and alternative financing models. I'd been researching for months, half convinced it was academic exercise rather than actual plan. Now it felt different. Now it felt like the beginning of something that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. I opened a blank document and started typing. Not a business plan. Not a pitch. Just thoughts, raw and unfiltered, about what it would take to build a project that challenged everything my father stood for. I wrote until my hands cramped and my eyes burned. I wrote until the sky outside my window shifted from black to gray. And when I finally stopped, I had 17 pages of ideas that were probably impossible and definitely reckless. But they were mine. Every word. Every concept. Every risk. And that was enough to fall asleep with something other than dread in my chest. It was enough to wake up Monday morning with purpose instead of panic. It was enough to walk into Elena's office and say yes when she asked if I was ready to learn how to build dreams without permission. Elena Reyes worked out of a converted warehouse in East Austin that still had exposed brick and pipes running across the ceiling like industrial veins. The space smelled like coffee and blueprint paper, and every surface held evidence of projects in various stages of completion. Models made from cardboard and balsa wood crowded the shelves. Fabric samples were pinned to corkboards alongside photographs of buildings that managed to be both functional and beautiful. This was what architecture looked like when it served people instead of egos. She was waiting for me with 2 cups of coffee and a manila folder that looked like it had survived several moves. Elena was in her late 50s, with silver streaks in her dark hair and laugh lines that suggested she'd learned to find humor in an industry that didn't always welcome women who refused to soften their ideas. She'd been one of the first people to hire me as an intern, back when my portfolio was half theory and half hope. She'd taught me that good design wasn't about signature statements. It was about listening to the people who would actually live and work in the spaces you created. She gestured to the chair across from her desk, and I sat, still feeling the weight of Friday's confrontation pressing on my shoulders like humidity. She didn't ask how the interview went. She already knew. News traveled fast in Austin's architecture circles, and my father's tendency to humiliate people who disappointed him was practically folklore. Instead, she opened the folder and pulled out a single photograph, edges worn from handling. It showed a small community center, modest and unassuming, with colorful murals covering its exterior walls. She told me she designed that building 23 years ago, fresh out of grad school and convinced she could change the world one project at a time. The developer who'd hired her was a man named Richard Calloway, who owned half the commercial properties in what was then a struggling neighborhood. He'd promised her creative control, a fair budget, and credit that would launch her career. She'd worked 16-hour days for 6 months, pouring everything she knew into a design that would serve the community's actual needs rather than some investor's vision of what poor people deserved. When the project was finished, Richard held a press conference. Every major publication in Texas sent reporters. He stood in front of her building, cutting a ribbon she hadn't been invited to hold, and announced that Calloway Development had single-handedly revitalized the neighborhood with innovative architecture that proved his company's commitment to social responsibility. He never mentioned her name. Not once. When she confronted him privately, he'd smiled and explained that clients owned the work. That's what the contract said. That's how the industry worked. If she wanted recognition, she should have negotiated better terms. Elena paused and took a long sip of coffee. She said she'd spent the next year angry enough to quit architecture entirely. She'd considered going back to school, maybe becoming a teacher like she'd originally planned. But anger, she said, was only useful if you let it teach you something. So she'd learned. She'd learned to read contracts like they were written by enemies. She'd learned to document everything, to keep copies of every sketch and email and revision. She'd learned that the system was designed to devour people like her, which meant the only way to survive was to build something outside the system entirely. That's when she started her own firm. No partners. No investors who could claim ownership of her ideas. Just her, a drafting table, and clients who were willing to take a chance on someone without a famous last name or an Ivy League degree. It had been slow. There were years when she'd barely made rent. Years when bigger firms tried to poach her best projects by offering clients more prestige and faster timelines. But she'd survived by being better, not louder. By designing buildings that actually worked for the people inside them instead of just looking impressive in architectural magazines. She slid the folder across the desk. Inside were contact names, phone numbers, email addresses. She explained that over 2 decades, she'd built a network of investors, developers, and community organizers who were tired of the Richard Callaways and Vincent Torreses of the world. People who believed that cities should be built for residents, not just revenue. Some were wealthy idealists. Others were former architects who'd been burned by the industry and wanted to fund projects that challenged the status quo. None of them would be easy to work with. They'd demand transparency, community input, and proof that sustainable design could generate profit. But they wouldn't steal my work. They wouldn't erase my name. And they wouldn't make me choose between integrity and survival. I stared at the list, hands trembling slightly as I held paper that felt heavier than it should. These weren't fantasy connections. These were real people with real capital who might actually listen to someone with more ambition than experience. Elena leaned back in her chair and told me the truth without sugarcoating it. She said I was young, unproven, and carrying a last name that would either open doors or slam them shut depending on who was listening. She said convincing anyone to fund a project led by a recent graduate with no commercial portfolio would be nearly impossible. She said I'd face rejection after rejection, that people would assume I was another entitled kid trading on family connections, that my father would likely hear about my attempts and do everything in his power to sabotage them. Then she asked if I was ready to fail publicly and keep going anyway. I thought about that question for a long moment, turning it over in my mind like an object I needed to examine from every angle. Failure had always been my father's favorite weapon. He'd used it to keep my mother small, to justify his control, to prove that anyone who challenged him would ultimately vindicate his worldview. Accepting Elena's help meant accepting that I might prove him right. It meant risking something worse than poverty or obscurity. It meant risking confirmation that I'd been foolish to believe I could matter without him. But sitting in that warehouse office, surrounded by evidence of what stubborn refusal could build over time, I realized something that felt like waking up. My father's certainty wasn't truth. It was just noise. Loud, persistent noise designed to drown out any voice that dared to contradict him. And I was done letting that noise determine the boundaries of what I attempted. I looked at Elena and told her yes. Yes, I was ready to fail. Yes, I was ready to be dismissed and doubted and told I was wasting everyone's time. Yes, I was ready to spend years building something that might collapse. Because the alternative was spending those same years wondering what I could have created if I'd been brave enough to try. She smiled then, not the polite smile people give when they're being encouraging, but the real kind that comes from recognizing someone who just made the same choice that had defined her entire career. She told me to start with the name at the top of the list. Marcus Chen. Corporate attorney who'd left a prestigious firm to focus on development deals that prioritized community benefit over maximum extraction. He was tough, she warned. He'd grill me on every aspect of my plan, poke holes in my financing model, and probably tell me I was being naive. But if I could convince him the project was viable, he'd make sure the legal framework protected me in ways my father's contract never would. I spent the next 3 days preparing. I refined my concept for the East Austin site, turning vague ideas into specific plans. Mixed-income housing with units priced for service workers, not just tech transplants. Ground floor retail reserved for local businesses with rent caps to prevent displacement. Shared courtyards and community spaces that encouraged interaction instead of isolation. Green infrastructure that would reduce energy costs and improve air quality. It was ambitious. Maybe too ambitious. But it was also necessary. Austin was changing so fast that entire neighborhoods were being erased, and nobody seemed interested in slowing down long enough to ask who was being left behind. I called Marcus Chen's office on Thursday morning and was surprised when he answered his own phone. His voice was clipped, efficient, like someone who'd learned to value time by watching other people waste it. I introduced myself, mentioned Elena's referral, and asked if he had 30 minutes to review a development proposal. He asked what kind of proposal. I told him affordable housing with sustainable design in a gentrifying neighborhood. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I didn't expect. He said he'd been waiting for someone to pitch him exactly that project for the past 5 years, and that I should come to his office tomorrow morning at 8 if I was serious. His office was in a nondescript building near the university, the kind of place that didn't advertise prestige because it didn't need to. Marcus was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of intense focus that made you want to have your facts straight before speaking. He gestured to a chair and asked to see my proposal. I handed him a bound presentation I'd printed at the library, complete with renderings, site analysis, and a preliminary budget that I'd spent 2 sleepless nights calculating. He read in silence for 15 minutes, occasionally making notes in the margins with a pencil he kept behind his ear. When he finished, he set the document down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He asked how much of my own money I was planning to invest. I told him the truth. $1,200. Everything I had. He didn't laugh, which I'd halfway expected. Instead, he asked why. Why this project? Why this neighborhood? Why now, when Austin was full of easier opportunities that wouldn't require fighting my father's influence at every turn? I told him about my mother's childhood home that no longer existed. About the families being pushed to the outskirts while luxury developments filled the center. About driving through East Austin and seeing for sale signs multiplying like weeds, each one representing someone's displacement dressed up as progress. I told him that my father had built his empire by treating neighborhoods like commodities, and that I wanted to prove cities could grow without devouring the people who'd built them. Marcus listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked one more question. He asked if I understood that this project would make me enemies. Not just competitors. Enemies. People with money and power who benefited from the system staying exactly as broken as it was. I met his eyes and said I'd already made the biggest enemy I'd ever have. One more wouldn't change much. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Then he told me the bad news. My budget was unrealistic. My timeline was too aggressive. My site selection was in a zone my father's company had been quietly acquiring properties in for the past 2 years, which meant I'd be directly competing with someone who had infinitely more resources and fewer scruples. He said that under normal circumstances, he'd recommend I get a few years of experience before attempting something this complicated. Then he told me the good news. He said normal circumstances were boring, and that if I was genuinely committed to this disaster waiting to happen, he'd help structure it in a way that gave me a fighting chance. He'd work for deferred payment, taking a percentage of profits if the project succeeded rather than fees up front. He'd help me navigate the city's permitting process, which was designed to favor established developers with expensive lawyers. And he'd introduce me to 2 investors from Elena's list who specialized in projects that conventional wisdom said couldn't work. I asked why. Why would he take that risk on someone with no track record and every reason to fail? He closed my proposal and slid it back across the desk. He said that 20 years ago, he'd been a junior associate at a firm that represented developers like my father. He'd watched them exploit legal loopholes, bully community organizers, and treat housing as a speculative investment rather than a human need. He'd made good money helping them do it. And then one day, He'd represented a developer trying to evict a 70-year-old woman from rent-controlled housing so they could flip the building. The woman had shown up to the hearing with photographs of her grandchildren, 3 generations who'd grown up in that apartment. She'd lost anyway. The law was on the developer's side. Marcus said he'd gone home that night and realized he'd spent his entire career being on the wrong side of everything that mattered. So he'd quit. Started over. Took a pay cut that made his ex-wife file for divorce. But he could sleep at night, which turned out to be worth more than the corner office he'd given up. He looked at me with something like recognition. He said I reminded him of that version of himself, the one who'd finally gotten angry enough to change direction. He said most people never found that anger. They just learned to live with the compromise. I left his office with a stack of paperwork, 3 scheduled meetings with potential investors, and the first real hope I'd felt since walking out of my father's building. Over the next 6 weeks, I lived in Elena's office, using her conference room to meet with people who had the power to make my project real or crush it with a single no. Some were skeptical. One investor told me I was too young to understand how cities actually worked. Another said my design was pretty but impractical, that affordable housing only worked if you cut corners on quality. A third asked if my father knew what I was doing, and when I said no, he suggested I reconsider before creating family drama that would follow me for the rest of my career. But 2 people said yes. The first was a retired schoolteacher named Dorothy Vance who'd inherited money from her late husband and wanted to invest in projects that honored his memory as a community organizer. She'd been fighting gentrification in East Austin for 30 years and said my proposal was the first one she'd seen that actually understood what the neighborhood needed. The second was a tech entrepreneur named Kevin Park who'd made millions selling a startup and was looking for ways to invest in Austin's future that didn't involve luxury condos. He'd grown up in affordable housing in California and said he wouldn't have made it without stable shelter during his childhood. Between them, they could provide 60% of the funding I needed. The rest would come from a combination of city grants, tax incentives for sustainable development, and a construction loan Marcus was confident he could secure once we had a solid foundation. It wasn't enough to break ground, but it was enough to start the real work. Enough to hire a structural engineer, commission soil tests, and file the permits that would make my project official in the eyes of the city. I was filling out paperwork at Elena's desk when my phone rang. My mother's number. I almost didn't answer. We'd been playing phone tag for weeks, her messages getting progressively more concerned, mine getting progressively more vague. But something made me pick up this time, maybe guilt, maybe the need to hear her voice before I did something that would make reconciliation with my father permanently impossible. She sounded tired. She asked where I'd been, why I hadn't come to dinner, whether I was eating properly and sleeping enough. I gave her the abbreviated version. Interview didn't work out, I'm pursuing other opportunities, everything's fine. There was a long pause, and then she said something that made my chest tighten. She said my father had been asking about me. Not directly. He'd never asked directly. But he'd mentioned my name more in the past month than he had in the previous 5 years. He'd asked her if she'd heard from me. If she knew where I was working. If I'd said anything about his offer. I could hear it in her voice, that careful hopefulness she always carried when she thought maybe this time things could be different. That maybe whatever wall stood between her husband and her daughter might finally crack. I wanted to tell her the truth. That he hadn't offered me a job, he'd offered me erasure. That I was building something specifically designed to challenge everything he represented. That the version of reconciliation she imagined required me to disappear into his shadow, and I'd rather burn my degree than do that. But I couldn't say any of that without forcing her to choose, and I'd spent my entire childhood watching her make herself smaller to avoid that exact choice. So I told her I loved her and that I'd visit soon, and I ended the call before she could ask the questions I wasn't ready to answer. I set the phone down on Elena's desk and stared at it like it might ring again, like my mother might call back and demand honesty even if it hurt. It stayed silent. Elena appeared in the doorway with printouts of the permits I'd need to file. She'd been through this process dozens of times and knew every bureaucratic trap waiting to slow us down. She said the city's planning commission met in 2 weeks, and that if I wanted to present my proposal publicly, I'd need to prepare for hostile questions from developers who saw affordable housing as competition and council members who measured success by property tax revenue. She said my father would almost certainly be in that room, and that he'd use every connection he had to undermine my credibility. I asked if she thought I was ready. She set the papers down and looked at me with that clear-eyed assessment I'd come to trust. She said nobody was ever ready to fight this kind of battle, but that readiness was overrated anyway. What mattered was whether I could stand in front of powerful people who wanted me to fail and speak like I deserved to be there. Whether I could absorb their contempt and keep going. Whether I understood that winning this fight wouldn't feel like victory, at least not at first. It would feel like exhaustion. I thought about that as I gathered my things and drove home through evening traffic. Austin's skyline glowed against the darkening sky, every tower a testament to someone's vision of what the city should become. My father's buildings were there, glass and steel monuments that bore his name in subtle lettering near the entrance. Someday, I thought, there would be one more building on that skyline. Something different. Something that prioritized people over profit margins. Something that proved his way wasn't the only way. My apartment was dark when I got home, and for once, I didn't mind the quiet. I made tea and sat by the window, watching headlights stream past on the street below. Somewhere in this city, my mother was sitting in a house too big for two people, probably wondering why I'd sounded so distant on the phone. Somewhere, my father was working late in his office, strategizing his next acquisition, convinced that his daughter's rebellion was temporary and inconsequential. And somewhere in the files on my laptop, there was a building that didn't exist yet but would. That had to. I opened my email and started drafting the presentation I delivered to the Planning Commission. Not the polished, impersonal language developers usually used, but something real. Something that explained why this project mattered beyond return on investment. I wrote about the grandmother I'd never met who'd raised my mother in a house that was now rubble. About the teachers and service workers being priced out of the city they'd built. About the difference between development that served communities and development that displaced them. It was past midnight when I finished, and the words on the screen blurred from staring too long. But they were true words. Words my father would hate because they challenged the fundamental logic of everything he'd built his career on. And that, I realized, was exactly the point. This wasn't just about constructing a building. It was about constructing an alternative to his version of success. A version where you could be profitable without being predatory. Where you could grow without destroying. Where your name on a building meant you'd honored the people inside it, not just your own ambition. I saved the document and closed my laptop, and for the first time since leaving his office, I felt something other than anger or anxiety. I felt certainty. Not the arrogant kind that comes from never being challenged, but the hard one kind that comes from choosing your path knowing exactly how difficult it will be. My father thought I'd come crawling back. He was wrong. I was going to make him watch me succeed without him. And I was going to name the building after the woman whose dreams he'd spent 30 years erasing. The Planning Commission met in a windowless room at City Hall that smelled like old carpet and recycled air. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in the kind of harsh illumination that made everyone look slightly unwell. I arrived 30 minutes early with a rolling case containing foam core presentation boards that I'd assembled in Elena's office, each one showing a different aspect of the project. Site plans. Elevation drawings. Community impact analysis. Financial projections that Marcus had reviewed 3 times to make sure the numbers could withstand scrutiny. The room filled slowly. Commission members took their seats at an elevated table, shuffling papers and checking phones with the casual authority of people who made decisions about other people's futures every week. In the audience, I recognized faces from my research. Neighborhood association representatives who'd been fighting displacement for years. A reporter from the Austin Chronicle who covered development politics. Several people in expensive suits who I assumed were developers or their representatives, here to monitor anything that might affect their interests. And in the back row, wearing a charcoal suit and an expression of studied indifference, sat my father. He didn't look at me. Didn't acknowledge my presence. Just sat with his arms folded, projecting the kind of quiet power that came from knowing he could destroy careers with a phone call. Seeing him there made my hands shake slightly as I set up my boards, but I forced myself to focus on the mechanical tasks. Unfold the legs. Position the displays. Arrange them so the commission could see the progression from concept to execution. Elena sat in the third row, notebook open, ready to take notes on anything that might be useful. Marcus was beside her, reviewing documents on his tablet. Dorothy and Kevin weren't there. We'd agreed it was better for them to stay anonymous until the project had official approval, to avoid my father identifying and pressuring my investors before we had legal protection. The commission chair, a woman named Patricia Hendricks who'd been on the board for 12 years, called the meeting to order and began working through the agenda. Rezoning requests. Variance applications. The mundane bureaucracy of urban planning delivered in monotone voices. My project was listed fourth. I watched the clock, watched other presenters make their cases, watched commission members ask technical questions that ranged from genuinely curious to thinly veiled hostility. When my name was called, I walked to the front with my presentation materials and stood behind the podium, suddenly aware of how young I must look to this room full of people who'd been navigating city politics longer than I'd been alive. I introduced myself and my project. The Torres Memorial Tower. Mixed-income residential development with sustainable design features and community-focused retail. As I spoke that name, I saw my father's jaw tighten in the back row, the first crack in his practiced indifference. I walked the commission through the specifics. 18 units total, 6 priced at market rate to subsidize 12 below-market units for service workers and families currently being displaced. Ground floor commercial space reserved for local businesses at capped rents. Green roof systems that would reduce stormwater runoff and energy costs. Shared community spaces designed with input from neighborhood associations. I explained the site selection, showing maps of how East Austin was changing, how families who'd lived there for generations were being pushed out by developments that prioritized profit over people. I showed comparative analysis of similar projects in other cities that had proven sustainable affordable housing could be financially viable if developers were willing to accept reasonable returns instead of maximum extraction. I walked them through the financing model, the combination of private investment, city incentives, and construction loans that would make it possible without requiring public subsidies beyond what the city already offered for sustainable development. The presentation took 12 minutes. When I finished, Patricia asked if there were questions from the commission. 3 hands went up immediately. The first question came from a younger member, a man named David Torres, no relation, who asked about my construction timeline. I explained we'd need 8 months for permitting and financing finalization, then approximately 18 months for construction, with occupancy targeted for late 2026. He nodded, seeming satisfied. The second question came from an older member who'd been on the commission long enough to have her name on a street sign. She asked about my experience managing projects of this scale. The question was fair, but the way she asked it carried an edge of skepticism that suggested she'd already decided I wasn't qualified. I acknowledged that this would be my first commercial project as lead architect, but emphasized that I was working with experienced contractors, a respected attorney, and had secured investors with decades of development experience who believed in the vision. The third question came from a man in his 60s who owned several properties in East Austin and had a reputation for opposing anything that might limit property value appreciation. He asked why the city should support a project that would artificially suppress rents when the free market was already efficiently allocating housing resources. The question was designed to make me sound naive, to frame affordability as economic interference rather than public good. I took a breath and answered that markets were only efficient if everyone had equal power, and that when one side controlled capital and the other side just needed shelter, efficiency became a polite word for exploitation. The room got quiet. I just challenged one of the fundamental assumptions that guided most development in Austin, and I'd done it in language that didn't pretend to be polite. The commissioner frowned and asked if I was suggesting that property owners didn't have the right to maximize their investments. I said that property owners had rights, but so did communities, and that when those rights conflicted, the city had to decide whether it valued housing as a human need or just another commodity. I said my project offered a model that respected both, creating market-rate units alongside affordable ones, generating profit while serving people who'd otherwise be displaced. Patricia intervened before the exchange could escalate into full debate. She asked if anyone from the public wanted to comment. 4 people stood. The first was a woman from the East Austin Neighborhood Association who'd been fighting gentrification for 20 years. She said her organization supported the project, that it was exactly the kind of development they'd been asking for, that Vanessa Torres was the first developer who'd actually listened to what the community needed instead of telling them what they should want. The second was a pastor from a local church who said his congregation was losing members every month because families couldn't afford to stay in the neighborhood where they'd worshiped for generations. He said this project represented hope that Austin could grow without erasing its history. The third was a small business owner who'd been priced out of 3 locations in 5 years and said the retail provisions would allow her to stay in business instead of being replaced by another boutique coffee shop. The fourth person to stand was my father. He walked to the front with the kind of measured confidence that came from decades of commanding rooms like this. He introduced himself as Vincent Torres, principal of Torres Development Group, and said he had concerns about the project that the commission should consider carefully. He said his daughter's intentions were admirable but unrealistic, that she lacked the experience to manage the complexities of urban development, that her financial model relied on overly optimistic assumptions about construction costs and rental income. He said he'd been developing properties in Austin for 30 years and had learned the hard way that good intentions didn't translate to good outcomes without expertise backing them up. He said the city would be doing everyone a disservice by approving a project that would likely fail, leaving investors burned and a neighborhood stuck with an incomplete or poorly executed building. He said this with just enough concern in his voice to sound like a caring father trying to protect his daughter from embarrassment, when what he was really doing was using his credibility to undermine mine. Patricia thanked him for his input and asked if I wanted to respond. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, knowing that how I handled this would determine whether the commission saw me as a serious developer or a naive kid playing architect. I could defend myself directly, which would look defensive. I could ignore him, which would look weak. Or I could do something else entirely. I thanked my father for his concerns and said he was absolutely right that experience mattered in development. That's why I'd assembled a team with exactly that experience. I gestured to where Marcus sat and explained that my attorney had 20 years of experience structuring deals like this and had reviewed every aspect of the financial model. I mentioned Elena without naming her directly, referring to my senior architectural consultant who'd been designing community-focused projects since before I was born. I explained that my investors included people who'd successfully completed similar developments and had done their own due diligence before committing capital. Then I said something that felt dangerous even as the words left my mouth. I said that my father was correct that many projects failed due to inexperience, but that the more common failure in Austin development was projects that succeeded financially while failing the communities they displaced. I said I'd rather risk failing while trying to do something meaningful than succeed at building another luxury tower that accelerated inequality. The room stayed quiet, but I could feel the tension shift. Several commission members were watching my father now, gauging his reaction. He didn't respond. Just returned to his seat with that same controlled expression, giving nothing away. Patricia called for a vote on whether to advance the project to the next stage of review. The vote was 4 in favor, 2 against, 1 abstention. Not unanimous, but enough. My project would move forward. I'd cleared the first real hurdle. As the meeting adjourned, people approached with business cards and questions. The neighborhood association president wanted to schedule a community input session. The reporter wanted an interview about intergenerational conflict in Austin development. A construction company owner said he'd worked on sustainable projects before and would be interested in bidding. I collected cards and made promises to follow up, all while watching my father from the corner of my eye. He spoke briefly with 2 commission members, conversations that looked casual but probably weren't. Then he left without looking in my direction, disappearing through the double doors like he'd never been there at all. Elena appeared at my elbow and told me I'd done well, that standing up to him publicly had been risky but necessary, that the commission would remember I hadn't backed down. Marcus was less encouraging. He said my father's testimony had been strategic, planting seeds of doubt without overtly sabotaging me, which meant he was taking me seriously enough to oppose me carefully. He said the real fight would come during permitting, when my father would have opportunities to delay or complicate the process through channels that weren't public. He said I should expect building inspectors to suddenly find problems, utility connections to face unexplained delays, contractors to mysteriously become unavailable or increase their bids after learning who they'd be competing against. We left City Hall and walked to a taqueria down the street, the kind of place that had been there forever and somehow survived rising rents through sheer stubbornness. Over cheap tacos and Mexican Coke, we debriefed. Elena said the community support had been genuine and would matter when we needed neighborhood backing for future approvals. Marcus said the vote margin was narrow enough that we couldn't afford to lose momentum, that we needed to move quickly on finalizing financing and securing contractors before opposition had time to organize. I barely tasted my food. My mind was still in that conference room, replaying the moment my father had stood to speak against me, using his reputation as a weapon disguised as paternal concern. Part of me had hoped he might stay silent, might let me succeed or fail on my own merits. But that wasn't who he was. He'd built his empire by crushing competition, and the fact that I was his daughter didn't grant me immunity. If anything, it made his opposition more intense because my success would implicitly critique everything he'd built his identity around. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Your father said you did well at the commission meeting." He sounded almost proud. I stared at those words, trying to parse what they meant. Almost proud. Almost. As if pride were something he rationed, something I had to earn by meeting standards he'd never articulate clearly enough for me to actually satisfy. I didn't respond. What could I say that wouldn't either hurt her or compromise what I was building? Instead, I put the phone away and focused on the conversation Elena and Marcus were having about next steps. Over the following weeks, Marcus's predictions proved accurate. The permitting process that should have taken 6 weeks stretched into 3 months. Building inspectors found issues that required additional engineering studies. The fire marshal had questions about exit configurations that required resubmitting plans. The environmental review got flagged for further analysis despite our site having no contamination history. Each delay cost time and money, eating into the construction timeline and investor confidence. I knew my father was behind it, but proving it was impossible. He was too smart to leave fingerprints. Instead, he'd just made phone calls, reminded old friends of favors owed, suggested that approving this project might set problematic precedents. The machinery of bureaucracy ground slowly, and I spent hours on hold with city departments, resubmitting paperwork, attending meetings to address concerns that seemed designed to exhaust rather than illuminate. Elena kept me grounded through those months, reminding me that opposition meant I was doing something that mattered, that easy approvals meant you weren't challenging anything worth challenging. Marcus worked angles I didn't fully understand, calling in his own favors, finding sympathetic officials who could expedite reviews, building relationships with staff members who could flag obstacles before they became crises. And slowly, grudgingly, the permits started clearing. By early autumn, we had everything we needed to break ground. The financing closed after tense negotiations where the bank tried to increase interest rates at the last minute, citing construction risk, which I suspected was code for my father making phone calls. But Dorothy and Kevin stayed committed, even offering to personally guarantee a portion of the loan when the bank wavered. The construction company we'd selected, a firm with experience in sustainable building, finalized their bid and locked in their crew. The groundbreaking was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October, deliberately low-key to avoid the kind of attention that might invite further interference. Just me, Elena, Marcus, the construction foreman, and a photographer from the neighborhood association who wanted to document the moment. The lot had been cleared, soil tests completed, foundation stakes marking where walls would rise. Standing there in the early morning light, wearing a borrowed hard hat and feeling simultaneously terrified and exhilarated, I realized this was actually happening. The building existed now, at least in the legal and financial sense. All that remained was the physical act of construction. We posed for photos, broke actual ground with ceremonial shovels that would immediately be replaced by excavation equipment, and shared coffee from a thermos Elena had brought. The foreman explained the schedule, how foundation work would take 6 weeks, how framing would follow, how we'd be dried in before winter. He spoke with the calm confidence of someone who'd built dozens of structures and knew that good planning made most problems solvable. I listened and took notes and tried to absorb the fact that I was now responsible for turning drawings into reality, for making sure that investors' money translated into something people could actually live in. The excavation began the next day. I visited the site every morning before going to the firm where I'd taken a part-time position to cover my living expenses. Watching the hole deepen, seeing the foundation forms take shape, feeling the ground vibrate from heavy machinery felt like watching something emerge from imagination into physical fact. It was slower than I'd expected and faster than I'd feared, the paradox of construction where days blend together but progress accumulates in sudden recognizable leaps. My mother called during foundation pour, the first time we'd spoken since the commission meeting. She asked how I was, really asked, with the kind of concern that couldn't be deflected with generic reassurance. I told her about the project, about the delays and small victories, about standing on a construction site that bore her name and feeling like maybe I was building something that would outlast the conflicts that had defined our family. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said she wished she could see it, that she drove past East Austin sometimes and wondered which lot was mine, that she imagined a building with her name on it and felt something she couldn't quite name. I asked why she didn't visit. Another long silence. She said my father wouldn't understand, that he'd see it as choosing sides, that her marriage required a kind of neutrality that visiting my construction site would violate. I wanted to ask when she'd last done something just because she wanted to, when her desires had last mattered more than his comfort, but I knew the answer would hurt us both. So instead I told her I loved her and that the building would be there when she was ready, whenever that might be. We ended the call with promises to talk soon, promises we both knew might take months to fulfill. The foundation cured and framing began, the skeleton of the building rising against the sky. I spent lunch breaks watching the crew work, amazed by how quickly walls appeared, how space that had been open air suddenly became rooms with purpose and dimension. The architect in me saw how design translated to construction, how decisions I'd made on paper months ago now determined where walls met, where windows would frame views, where people would move through spaces that currently existed only as wood and potential. Winter came, bringing cold fronts that delayed concrete work and made morning site visits miserable. But the building kept growing. Roof trusses went up. Exterior sheathing began. The shape became recognizable, no longer just framework but something approaching architecture. My father never visited the site, but I knew he was watching. Tracking permits. Monitoring progress. Waiting for the failure he'd predicted. I sometimes wondered what he thought, driving past and seeing his name on a building he'd opposed, whether it bothered him that I'd used my mother's name instead of his, whether he understood the message that decision carried. By spring, the exterior was complete and interior work began. Drywall and electrical and plumbing, the invisible infrastructure that made buildings livable. I met with suppliers, approved material selections, made hundreds of small decisions about finishes and fixtures that would determine whether the building felt welcoming or institutional. Elena taught me to think about how light would move through spaces, how colors would affect mood, how details that most people wouldn't consciously notice would subconsciously shape their experience of home. The retail spaces took shape on the ground floor, designed with flexibility so different businesses could adapt them to specific needs. The residential units above ranged from studios to 2 bedrooms, each one carefully planned to maximize space and natural light despite the affordability constraints. I walked through them during construction, imagining the families who'd live here, the routines that would unfold in these rooms, the relief of finding housing that didn't consume 70% of their income. Marcus called in early June with news. The city wanted to feature the project in a press release about innovative affordable housing development. It would mean publicity, validation, proof that the model worked. It would also mean my father would see it, would have to watch the media celebrate something he'd tried to prevent. Marcus asked if I was ready for that kind of attention. I thought about it for less than a second before saying yes. I'd spent a year building this project quietly, avoiding conflict where possible. But at some point, silence became complicity in your own erasure. It was time to let people see what I'd created. The press release went live on a Thursday morning, and by noon, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. 3 local news stations wanted interviews. The Austin Chronicle requested a feature story. A podcast about urban development asked me to be a guest. The attention was overwhelming and validating in equal measure, proof that the project resonated beyond just my personal vendetta against my father's development philosophy. People genuinely cared about affordable housing, about sustainable design, about whether Austin could grow without becoming unrecognizable to the people who'd built it. I did 2 interviews that week, choosing outlets carefully based on Marcus's advice. The first was with a reporter who specialized in housing policy and understood the technical aspects of what made the project innovative. The second was with a community-focused publication that served East Austin's longtime residents, the people most affected by gentrification. Both interviews asked about my father. Both times, I deflected gracefully, saying I respected his contributions to Austin's development while pursuing a different approach. I didn't mention the commission meeting, the permits he delayed, the subtle sabotage I couldn't prove but knew existed. The articles published within days of each other. The policy piece focused on financing models and zoning innovations, treating the project as a case study in alternative development. The community piece was more personal, featuring quotes from neighborhood residents who'd watched their streets transform and felt hope that maybe this transformation could include them instead of displacing them. Both articles mentioned my age, my recent graduation, and inevitably, my last name. The policy piece noted that I was the daughter of Vincent Torres but emphasized I was charting my own course. The community piece barely mentioned him at all, which somehow felt like a bigger statement. My father's response came through my mother. She called on a Sunday evening, voice strained in the way it got when she was delivering messages she didn't want to deliver. She said he'd seen the articles. That he thought the attention was premature given the building wasn't complete. That media coverage created expectations that could backfire if anything went wrong during construction. That he hoped I understood the responsibility I'd taken on and wouldn't let pride prevent me from asking for help if I needed it. Every word was his, delivered through her, because direct communication between us had become impossible somewhere along the way. I asked her what she thought, not him, her. Long silence on the line, so long I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Then she said something that made my throat tighten. She said she'd driven past the site last week when she knew he was out of town. That she'd parked across the street and watched construction workers moving through the building that would carry her name. That she'd sat there for 20 minutes, crying in a way she couldn't fully explain, something about seeing her name on something real and permanent after spending 30 years as an appendage to someone else's ambitions. She said it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever done for her, and that she was sorry she couldn't say it where he might hear. I told her she didn't need to apologize, that I understood the impossible position she was in, that loving both of us didn't mean choosing between us. But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. At some point, neutrality became its own kind of choice, a decision to preserve peace at the cost of standing for anything. I didn't say that. I just told her I loved her and that the building would be there, with her name on it, regardless of what happened between me and my father. We ended the call with the usual promises, and I sat in my apartment feeling the weight of family loyalty pulling in directions that couldn't be reconciled. Construction continued through summer heat that made the site miserable by midday. I adjusted my visits to early morning and late afternoon, watching the crew work with an efficiency that came from clear communication and good leadership. The foreman, a man named Robert Shen who'd been in construction for 25 years, ran the site with the kind of quiet competence that made problems solvable before they became crises. He'd worked on Elena's projects before and understood that sustainable building required attention to detail that conventional construction often skipped. In late July, something happened that Marcus had warned me about but I'd hoped to avoid. A city inspector showed up for a routine framing inspection and failed us on a technicality involving fire blocking that was actually compliant with code but interpreted differently than the inspector preferred. It wasn't a major issue, just a difference in implementation methods, but it required scheduling a re-inspection and potentially delaying the next phase of work. Robert was frustrated but not surprised. He said this inspector had a reputation for being particular, which was code for being influenced by developers who knew how to make him more or less cooperative. I called Marcus, who made calls of his own, and within 2 days we had a second inspector who reviewed the same framing and approved it without issue. But the message was clear. My father still had influence over the bureaucratic machinery that could slow or stop construction, and he was willing to use it. The failed inspection cost us a week and several $1,000s in crew downtime, money we couldn't afford to waste given our tight budget. It was a reminder that winning approval didn't mean winning the war, that power expressed itself in countless small acts of interference that accumulated into real obstacles. August brought another challenge. The HVAC subcontractor we'd hired, a company with good references and competitive pricing, suddenly withdrew from the project. Their explanation was vague, something about scheduling conflicts and other commitments, but the timing was suspicious. We'd already signed contracts and they'd ordered equipment. Backing out now meant potential legal action, but it also meant delays finding a replacement. Robert suspected someone had offered them more money to walk away or threatened consequences if they stayed. Either way, we needed a new HVAC contractor fast. Elena connected me with a woman named Sofia Ruiz who ran a mechanical contracting business and had a reputation for taking on projects that mainstream contractors avoided. She was expensive, but her work was excellent and she didn't scare easily. When I explained the situation, including my suspicion that my father was behind the previous contractor's withdrawal, she laughed and said she'd been blacklisted by half the developers in Austin for refusing to cut corners and didn't have much left to lose. She gave me a quote that was 20% higher than the original contractor but included guarantees that made the premium worth it. We signed paperwork that afternoon. September arrived with the building substantially complete on the exterior and interior work progressing. Drywall was up, painting had started, and the units were beginning to feel like actual spaces where people might live rather than abstract architectural concepts. I walked through with Elena, discussing final touches, adjusting paint colors based on how natural light moved through rooms at different times of day. She taught me that the difference between good design and great design often came down to these final details, the things most people wouldn't consciously notice but would subconsciously respond to. We were standing in what would become a two-bedroom unit on the third floor when my phone rang. Unknown number, Austin area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man's voice, professional and slightly nervous, introduced himself as Bradley Morrison from the Austin Business Journal. He said he was working on a story about family dynamics in Austin's development industry and wanted to interview me about working in the same field as my father. I asked what angle he was pursuing. He said he'd heard there was tension between Vincent Torres and his daughter's affordable housing project, that sources suggested Vincent had been working behind the scenes to undermine it, and that readers would be interested in that narrative. I told him I'd need to think about it and ended the call. Marcus's number was already in my hand when Elena stopped me. She said this was the moment I needed to decide what kind of developer I wanted to be. I could decline the interview, keep things private, avoid escalating conflict with my father. Or I could go on record, tell the truth about the obstacles I'd faced, and let the public decide whether a powerful developer using his influence to sabotage his own daughter's affordable housing project was a story worth caring about. She said neither choice was wrong, but they led to very different futures. I thought about my mother, about how exposing my father's behavior would hurt her, would force her to choose sides in a conflict she'd spent years trying to avoid. I thought about how going public might invite even more aggressive interference, might give him a reason to escalate from subtle sabotage to open warfare. But I also thought about every young architect who'd been crushed by powerful people protecting their territory, about every good project that died because challenging the status quo was too expensive, about the difference between being respected and being feared. I called Bradley Morrison back and agreed to the interview with one condition. I wanted to see the relevant portions of the article before publication to ensure accuracy, not to veto content but to correct any factual errors. He agreed. We scheduled a meeting for the following week at the construction site, on the record, with photos. Marcus said I was either very brave or very reckless, possibly both. Elena said sometimes the only difference between those two things was whether you succeeded. The interview took place on a Tuesday afternoon with the building as backdrop. Bradley arrived with a photographer and a list of questions that were more direct than I'd expected. He asked about my relationship with my father, about the commission meeting where he'd testified against my project, about the permits that had taken 3 times longer than they should have. He asked if I had proof that Vincent Torres had interfered, and I told him the truth. No smoking gun, just a pattern of obstacles that didn't make sense unless someone with influence was making phone calls. He asked if I was afraid of retaliation. I said I'd already experienced retaliation, that the question wasn't whether he'd oppose me but whether I'd let that opposition determine what I built. The photographer took pictures of me standing in front of the building, in units that were nearly finished, with construction workers in the background. Bradley asked about my mother, about the building's name, about whether dedicating it to her was a message to my father. I said it was a message to her, recognition of someone whose dreams had been deferred so someone else's could flourish. I said that women of her generation often sacrificed their ambitions to support their husbands, and that maybe it was time their names appeared on buildings too. He asked if my father knew about the dedication. I said he'd find out when everyone else did, at the ribbon cutting I was planning for November. The article published the following week with the headline "Austin Developer's Daughter Builds Affordable Housing Despite Father's Opposition." It was fair, presenting both sides while making clear that the evidence supported my version of events. It quoted anonymous sources within city government confirming that unusual delays had affected my permits. It included a statement from my father's company saying Vincent Torres supported innovative development but had concerns about projects led by inexperienced architects, making no mention of our relationship. It quoted community leaders praising the project and criticizing the obstacles it had faced. The response was immediate and intense. My phone flooded with messages of support from people I'd never met. The story got picked up by regional news outlets, then a few national ones interested in the angle of generational conflict in urban development. A Texas monthly writer called about a longer feature. An architectural magazine wanted to do a case study. The attention was flattering and terrifying, proof that people cared but also pressure to succeed because failure would now be very public. My father's response came not through my mother this time, but directly. An email from his company account, formal and cold. It stated that Vincent Torres respected my right to pursue my career independently but wanted to clarify that any suggestions of improper interference were categorically false and potentially defamatory. It said that normal permitting processes sometimes took longer than applicants expected, and that attributing routine delays to personal vendettas was both inaccurate and unprofessional. It said he hoped I would focus on completing my project successfully rather than seeking publicity through baseless accusations against my family. I read it 3 times, looking for any hint of the father I remembered from childhood, the one who'd occasionally shown pride in my drawings, who'd taken me to construction sites when I was small and let me wear his hard hat. There was nothing. Just corporate language designed to create legal distance while delivering a personal threat. I showed it to Marcus, who said it was exactly what he'd expected, a preemptive defense in case I escalated with more specific allegations. He said I should save it but not respond, that engaging would only give him ammunition. October brought the final push. Appliances were installed. Flooring went down. Light fixtures and hardware transformed spaces from construction zones to homes. The retail spaces took their final form, ready for the small businesses that had already signed leases. A bookstore focusing on Lading's authors. A bakery run by a woman who'd been pushed out of 3 previous locations by rising rents. A family practice medical clinic serving the neighborhood's uninsured residents. Each one represented the kind of business that made communities functional rather than just profitable. I met with each tenant, walking them through their spaces, listening to their plans and concerns. The bookstore owner was in her 60s and said she'd been waiting her whole life for a landlord who understood that some businesses mattered beyond their profit margins. The baker cried when she saw her kitchen, said it was bigger than anywhere she'd worked before and the rent was something she could actually afford. The doctor, a young woman just out of residency, said she'd chosen family practice specifically to serve communities like this one and had almost given up finding clinic space she could afford. These conversations reminded me why the project mattered beyond my conflict with my father. Real people would work and live here. Their children would grow up in these units, walk to that bakery, get care at that clinic. The building was becoming infrastructure for lives that deserved stability, and that responsibility felt heavier than any conflict with my father. The ribbon cutting was scheduled for November 15th, exactly 18 months after breaking ground. Invitations went to city officials, community leaders, investors, and media. My mother received one at a separate address I'd found through an old friend, a P.O. box she maintained for mail she didn't want my father seeing. I didn't know if she'd come. I hoped she would but understood if she couldn't. Dorothy and Kevin were coming, along with Elena and Marcus and dozens of people who'd supported the project in various ways. I didn't send an invitation to my father. That omission was intentional, a statement that this victory wasn't his to attend, that he'd forfeited his right to participate when he'd chosen opposition over support. But I knew he'd hear about it. Knew he'd see the coverage, read the articles, watch his daughter succeed at something he'd predicted would fail. That knowledge sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and solid and permanent. The morning of November 15th arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of Texas weather that made you forget winter was supposed to exist. I'd been awake since 4, unable to sleep through the anxiety and anticipation tangled in my chest like competing currents. By 6, I was at the site, walking through units one final time, checking that everything was ready. The building looked better than I'd imagined during those late nights sketching in my apartment. Sunlight poured through windows onto walls painted in warm neutrals that Elena had selected. The floors gleamed. The fixtures sparkled. Every detail spoke to the care we'd put into creating spaces that honored the people who would live here. The crew had hung a banner across the front entrance. Torres Memorial Tower, grand opening. Seeing those words in 3-foot letters made something catch in my throat. My mother's name, permanent and public, attached to something that would stand long after all of us were gone. I stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the building, and felt the weight of what we'd accomplished. Not just me. Elena, Marcus, Dorothy, Kevin, Robert, Sophia, and dozens of others who'd believed this was possible when conventional wisdom said it wasn't. By 9, people started arriving. Neighborhood residents came first, curious about the building they'd watched rise over the past year and a half. I gave impromptu tours, showing families the units they'd soon call home, introducing business owners to their retail spaces, answering questions about rent and leases and move-in dates. Their excitement was genuine and infectious. One mother with 3 children said she'd been living in a 1-bedroom apartment for 6 years, paying more than half her income, and that a 2-bedroom unit here would change everything for her family. She asked if she could take photos to show her kids, and I said of course, this is your home now. City officials arrived around 10, including 2 commission members who'd voted for the project and Patricia Hendricks, who'd abstained but seemed genuinely impressed by what she saw. A photographer from the Austin Chronicle captured moments I'd remember later when the day became a blur. Elena standing beside the architectural rendering mounted in the lobby, comparing it to the finished building. Marcus reviewing lease documents with new tenants. Dorothy and Kevin speaking with community leaders who'd supported us from the beginning. The ribbon cutting was scheduled for 11. I'd prepared remarks, revised them a dozen times, then abandoned the script entirely because formal speeches felt wrong for an occasion this personal. By 10:45, a crowd had gathered in front of the building. Neighbors, supporters, media with cameras, city staff, everyone who'd been part of making this happen. I scanned faces, looking for one in particular, not sure whether I hoped to find it or dreaded it. She appeared at 10:50, walking slowly from a parking spot down the block. My mother, wearing a blue dress I'd never seen before, sunglasses hiding her eyes despite the morning sun being gentle. She stayed at the back of the crowd, trying to remain invisible, but I saw her immediately. Our eyes met across 50 feet of sidewalk, and in that glance, I understood everything she couldn't say aloud. That she was proud. That she was scared. That being here was an act of rebellion she'd probably pay for later. That she'd come anyway because some moments mattered more than peace. I looked away before the emotion in my chest could overwhelm the composure I needed to maintain. Elena appeared beside me with scissors for the ribbon cutting, and suddenly it was time. The crowd quieted. I stood at the building's entrance, flanked by Elena and Marcus, with Dorothy and Kevin just behind. The red ribbon stretched across the doorway, ceremonial and symbolic and about to be severed. I spoke without notes, looking at faces instead of cameras. I thanked Elena for teaching me that good architecture served people, not egos. I thanked Marcus for protecting my work when I was too inexperienced to know what threats to anticipate. I thanked Dorothy and Kevin for believing in a project that promised meaning over maximum profit. I thanked the neighborhood for welcoming a building that tried to grow with the community instead of replacing it. I thanked the construction crew for turning drawings into reality with skill and integrity. Then I talked about my mother. I said that this building carried her name because she'd spent 30 years supporting someone else's dreams while her own went unspoken. I said she'd taught me that kindness wasn't weakness and that patience wasn't the same as surrender. I said that women of her generation had built empires through their sacrifices, and that maybe it was time we acknowledged those contributions with something more permanent than gratitude. I said I hoped this building would remind people that behind every successful person was often someone who'd given up their own success to make room, and that we owed those people more than footnotes in other people's stories. I looked directly at her when I said it, and even with sunglasses hiding her expression, I saw her hand move to her mouth, shoulders shaking with emotion she was trying to contain. Around her, people turned to look, recognizing from my gaze who I was addressing. Someone started clapping, then others joined, and suddenly the crowd was applauding my mother, this woman most of them had never met, honoring a type of contribution that rarely got acknowledged in a city obsessed with visible achievement. I cut the ribbon, and the crowd surged forward for tours. In the commotion, my mother disappeared. I searched for her, wanting to talk, to hug her, to tell her everything I couldn't say during the speech. But she was gone, probably by design, probably needing to leave before anyone asked questions or took photos that might reveal her presence to my father. Her absence felt like both loss and gift. She'd come. She'd heard. She'd let herself be honored, even if only for a moment. That would have to be enough. The rest of the morning blurred into handshakes and photographs and interviews. A television crew filmed a segment about affordable housing innovation. The Austin Chronicle reporter asked about future projects, whether I planned to develop more buildings using this model. I said I hoped to, but that success would depend on proving this one worked, on demonstrating that profit and purpose weren't mutually exclusive. Bradley Morrison from the Business Journal was there, taking notes for a follow-up piece about how the project had turned out despite the obstacles. By noon, most of the crowd had dispersed, leaving the core team and a few lingering neighbors. We gathered in the lobby, exhausted and exhilarated, processing what had just happened. Elena said the building exceeded her expectations, that I'd taken her guidance and made something distinctly my own. Marcus said the legal structure would serve as a template for future affordable developments, that we'd created a model other architects could replicate. Dorothy said seeing families walk through their new homes reminded her why she'd invested in people over property values. Kevin said this project had restored his faith that Austin could grow inclusively if enough people cared enough to fight for it. Robert, the foreman, approached with something in his hand. A small plaque, custom-made, with an inscription he and the crew had commissioned without telling me. It read, Torres Memorial Tower. Built by people who believed cities should serve communities, not just capital. Completed November 2026. He said the crew wanted to install it in the lobby as a permanent reminder of what made this building different. I accepted it with hands that shook slightly, overwhelmed by the gesture and everything it represented. We were installing the plaque when the door opened and a figure I'd hoped wouldn't appear stepped inside. My father, wearing a business suit and an expression I couldn't decipher. The lobby went silent. Elena moved closer to me, a subtle show of support. Marcus's posture shifted, ready to intervene if needed. But my father didn't approach aggressively. He just stood there, looking around the lobby, taking in the building he'd tried to prevent. He walked slowly through the space, examining finishes, studying the architectural details visible from the entrance. No one spoke. We just watched him move through the building like an inspector assessing quality. He paused at the rendering mounted on the wall, comparing the design concept to the execution. He read the building's name on the dedication plaque we just installed. And then, finally, he turned to face me. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than I expected. He said the building was well executed, that the design showed maturity beyond my experience level, that I'd chosen contractors who knew their trades. He said the location was smart, positioned in a neighborhood that would appreciate over time, meaning the investment would likely perform well even with below-market units. He said that from a development perspective, I'd made choices that balanced idealism with pragmatism, which was rare in young architects who usually leaned too far in one direction. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said my mother had called him this morning, crying, saying she was going to the ribbon cutting regardless of his opinion. He said she'd told him that watching me build something while he tried to tear it down had broken something in her, that she'd spent 30 years maintaining peace by staying silent but couldn't do it anymore. He said she'd given him a choice. Support our daughter or lose me. He said he'd thought she was bluffing until he came home an hour ago and found her closet empty and a note saying she was staying with her sister until he decided what kind of man he wanted to be. The lobby remained silent. I didn't know what to say, couldn't process the information fast enough to formulate a response. My mother had left him. Left the mansion in Westlake Hills, left the life she'd built around his success, left the marriage she'd maintained through 3 decades of compromise. And she'd done it because of this building, because of me, because somewhere in watching me refuse to disappear, she'd found the courage to stop disappearing herself. My father looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not pride, exactly. Something more complicated. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that I'd become someone he couldn't control or diminish, that I'd built something he couldn't tear down no matter how much influence he had. He said he didn't know if he could be the man my mother wanted him to be, but that he'd come here to see what was worth losing her over. He said he thought maybe he understood now, though understanding and accepting weren't the same thing. He turned toward the door, then stopped. Without looking back, he said one more thing. He said the building's name was appropriate, that my mother had always been the stronger one, that he'd spent their marriage mistaking her kindness for weakness when really she'd been strong enough to love someone who didn't deserve it. He said maybe I'd inherited that strength, that ability to care about things beyond winning. Then he left, the door closing behind him with a soft click that echoed in the quiet lobby. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Elena exhaled and said that was the most emotionally complicated ribbon cutting she'd ever attended. Marcus asked if I was okay, and I realized I was crying without having noticed when the tears started. Not sad tears. Not exactly happy ones either. Just the release of tension I'd been carrying for so long it had become part of my baseline existence. Dorothy approached and hugged me without asking permission, and I let myself be held by this woman who'd invested in my dream when it was just sketches and stubbornness. She whispered that my mother was welcome to stay with her if she needed a place, that women who finally left difficult marriages deserved support from other women who understood what that decision cost. I thanked her, still processing the information that my mother had left, that my building had somehow catalyzed the choice she'd been avoiding for years. The celebration resumed, though the mood had shifted from triumphant to contemplative. People drifted out gradually, leaving me with Elena and Marcus in the lobby as afternoon light slanted through windows. Elena said I should go find my mother, that she was probably at her sister's house waiting to hear from me. Marcus said he'd handle the remaining paperwork, that this day was about family more than legal documents. I thanked them both and walked to my car, still feeling the weight of everything that had happened in the past few hours. I drove to my aunt's house in South Austin, a neighborhood that hadn't gentrified yet, where houses still had chain-link fences and cars in various states of repair-filled driveways. My mother's sedan was parked on the street, and I sat in my car for a moment, gathering courage for a conversation I didn't know how to start. Finally, I walked to the door and knocked. My aunt answered, hugged me hard, and pointed toward the backyard without saying anything. My mother sat at a patio table under a live oak tree, still wearing the blue dress from the ribbon cutting. Her sunglasses were off now, revealing eyes red from crying but also lighter somehow, unburdened. She saw me and stood, and we met in the middle of the small yard in a hug that felt like everything we'd never been able to say to each other. She smelled like the perfume she'd worn my entire childhood, familiar and comforting and heartbreaking. We sat together at the table, and she started talking before I could ask questions. She said she'd been planning to leave for months, maybe years if she was honest, that watching me walk away from his offer and build something on my own had shown her what courage looked like. She said she'd spent the ribbon-cutting ceremony standing in the back of the crowd, listening to me dedicate the building to her, hearing strangers applaud sacrifices they'd never witnessed, and something inside her had finally broken open. She said she'd called him from the car and told him she was done being an accessory to his ambition, that she wanted to be a person again instead of a wife, that if he couldn't support our daughter then she couldn't support him. I asked if she was scared. She laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in years, genuine and unguarded. She said she was terrified, that she'd spent 3 decades building her life around his, that she didn't know who she was without him or whether she could survive independently at her age. But she said fear wasn't reason enough to stay anymore, that watching me risk failure to build something meaningful had taught her that some things were worth being afraid for. We talked for hours, sitting under that oak tree while the sun moved across the sky. She told me stories I'd never heard about her life before marriage, about the art classes she'd taught, about the mural she'd painted in an elementary school that had since been demolished. She told me about small rebellions over the years, the ways she'd maintained tiny pieces of herself when he wasn't watching. She told me she'd saved money secretly for the past decade, just in case, that she wasn't as helpless as she'd seemed. I told her about the building's construction, about the obstacles and small victories, about every time I'd wanted to call her but hadn't because I didn't want to force her to choose sides. I told her that naming the building after her had been the easiest decision I'd made during the entire project, that seeing her name on something permanent felt like correcting a historical injustice. I told her I was proud of her for leaving, that it took more courage than building any structure. As evening approached, she asked about my father, about what he'd said in the lobby. I repeated his words as accurately as I could remember them, and she listened with an expression that cycled through emotions too complex to name. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that surprised me. She said she didn't hate him, that hate required energy she didn't want to spend anymore. She said he'd been shaped by a world that rewarded ruthlessness and punished vulnerability, and that maybe he'd never learned there were other ways to be powerful. She said she hoped he'd figure that out, but that his growth wasn't her responsibility anymore. I stayed for dinner, which my aunt cooked while telling stories about my mother's childhood that made us all laugh. It felt like the beginning of something, like we were establishing a new kind of family dynamic that didn't require permission from anyone else. As I prepared to leave, my mother walked me to my car. She said she'd start looking for an apartment in East Austin, somewhere near the building, that she wanted to be close to the thing that bore her name. She said maybe she'd volunteer with the Tenants Association, or teach art classes for the kids who'd live there, that she was ready to reclaim the parts of herself she'd set aside. I drove home with the windows down, letting November air wash over me. My phone had 17 missed calls and twice as many text messages. Some were from reporters wanting statements about my father's appearance at the ribbon cutting. Some were from friends congratulating me on the building's completion. One was from Kevin, saying that a group of investors had reached out asking if I'd be interested in consulting on similar projects in other cities. That word was spreading about what we'd accomplished. But the message that stopped me was from a number I didn't recognize. I pulled over to read it properly. It said, "This is your father. Your mother made her choice clear. I'm not ready to make mine. But I wanted you to know that the building is exceptional work. That much I can say with certainty. Don't expect more than that right now." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was acknowledgement, recognition that I'd succeeded at something he'd thought impossible. For now, that was enough. The next morning, I returned to the building early, wanting to experience it in silence before the chaos of move-ins began. The lobby was peaceful, morning light creating geometric patterns on the floor. I walked through halls that would soon echo with children's laughter and neighbors' conversations, through units that would become homes filled with specific lives and dreams. The building felt alive in a way that justified every obstacle, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. I stood in the lobby and looked at the plaque the construction crew had installed. Torres Memorial Tower. Built by people who believed cities should serve communities, not just capital. Those words captured everything I'd been trying to prove, that development could be different if enough people refused to accept that profit required exploitation. The building was proof, physical and permanent, that another way was possible. Elena found me there an hour later, 2 coffees in hand and a smile that suggested she'd been expecting to find me exactly where she did. She said Marcus had called with news that the city wanted to use our building as a case study for updating their affordable housing policies, that what we'd accomplished was influencing conversations beyond just this one project. She said that was how change actually happened, not through grand gestures but through stubborn people building alternatives until the alternative became the new normal. We walked through the building together, her pointing out details I'd designed and forgotten in the chaos of construction, me seeing through her eyes how far I'd come from that scared graduate sitting in her office 18 months ago. She said I'd proven what she'd suspected when she first hired me as an intern, that I had the rare combination of technical skill and genuine care that made exceptional architecture possible. She said most people had one or the other, but both together was what separated buildings that functioned from buildings that mattered. Over the following weeks, families moved in. I met them all, learned their stories, watched the building transform from empty potential into lived reality. The grandmother who'd been displaced 3 times and cried when she got her keys, saying this was the first place she'd lived in a decade that felt like home instead of temporary shelter. The single father working 2 jobs who could finally afford a 2-bedroom so his kids could have their own rooms. The young couple saving for a house who could now put money away instead of spending everything on rent. The retail spaces came alive too. The bookstore opened with a launch party that filled the sidewalk with neighbors who'd never had a bookstore within walking distance before. The bakery's line stretched down the block on opening day, people supporting a business that had survived gentrification through sheer determination. The medical clinic started seeing patients, providing care to people who'd been going without because they couldn't afford it and didn't qualify for programs. Marcus called one afternoon to say he'd been contacted by architects in Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, all asking about replicating the model. He said our project had proven that affordable housing could be financially sustainable, architecturally excellent, and community-serving simultaneously. He said developers who dismissed the idea as naive idealism were now asking how to structure similar deals, not because they'd suddenly developed social consciousness but because they saw an underserved market and a legal framework that made it viable. My mother visited regularly, walking through the building like a tourist exploring a monument built in her honor. She'd enrolled in art classes at the community college and was talking about teaching again, maybe starting with kids who lived in the building. She'd found a small apartment 3 blocks away, nothing fancy but hers, decorated with artwork she'd been hiding in storage for years. She seemed younger somehow, unburdened by the need to be someone she'd never been comfortable being. My father and I hadn't spoken since the ribbon cutting, though my mother said he'd asked about me occasionally, questions that stopped short of actual engagement but suggested he was paying attention. She said he'd driven past the building twice that she knew of, slowing down but never stopping, observing from a distance what he couldn't acknowledge up close. She said change came slowly for people who'd spent lifetimes building armor against vulnerability, and that I shouldn't expect sudden transformation just because I wanted it. 6 months after the opening, the building received an award from the Texas chapter of the American Institute of Architects for innovative affordable housing design. The ceremony was formal and a little stuffy, full of people whose buildings I'd studied in school, and standing among them felt surreal. Elena accepted the award with me, insisting we designed it together even though we both knew I'd done most of the work. In her acceptance speech, she said the award belonged to everyone who'd believed cities could grow without destroying communities, and that the real measure of success would be whether we built 10 more buildings like this one. A year after opening, I stood on the sidewalk where I'd stood during the ribbon cutting, looking up at the building that had consumed my life for 2 years. It had weathered well. The facade had developed a patina that made it feel established rather than new. The courtyard trees I'd planted had grown enough to provide shade. Children played in the common areas while their parents watched from benches. The bookstore's windows displayed new titles. The bakery's door opened and closed constantly, releasing the smell of fresh bread into the neighborhood. This was what success looked like. Not dramatic or glamorous or particularly impressive to people who measured achievement by scale and revenue. Just functional, serving its purpose, making people's lives measurably better in small daily ways that accumulated into something significant. My father's buildings dominated the skyline, tall and gleaming and undeniably impressive. Mine was 6 stories and barely visible from downtown. But mine had people living in it who could afford their rent, who weren't being displaced, who had stability in a city that increasingly offered none. My phone rang. My mother, asking if I wanted to have dinner at her apartment. She'd learned to cook properly since leaving my father, experimenting with recipes instead of reheating prepared meals or eating at restaurants where he chose the menu. I said yes, like I always did now, grateful for the relationship we were building without the weight of his presence distorting every interaction. She said she'd invited my aunt and that I should bring Elena if she was free, that she wanted to thank the woman who'd believed in her daughter when it mattered most. As I drove to her apartment later that evening, I passed my father's headquarters downtown. Lights blazed from the executive floors where he was probably working late, closing deals, expanding his empire. I wondered if he ever thought about the building with my mother's name on it, whether it bothered him that his daughter had succeeded without his help or whether he'd compartmentalized it as irrelevant to his definition of success. I wondered if he was lonely in that penthouse office, surrounded by monuments to achievement that had cost him his family. But I didn't wonder long. His choices were his to live with, just as mine were mine. I'd chosen to build something that prioritized people over profit, community over capital, legacy measured in lives improved rather than revenue generated. He'd chosen differently. Neither of us could force the other to validate our choices, but I didn't need his validation anymore. The building stood regardless of his opinion, and that was enough. Dinner at my mother's apartment was loud and warm and exactly what family should be. We laughed about construction disasters and celebrated small victories. We made plans for future projects, talked about cities I might work in, neighborhoods that needed what Austin was slowly learning to provide. My mother showed us sketches she'd been working on, ideas for murals that might adorn buildings if anyone would have them. Elena said she knew developers who'd pay for that kind of work, that public art was increasingly valued in affordable housing as a way of honoring communities instead of erasing them. Driving home late that night, I thought about the girl who'd sat in my father's conference room 2 years ago, holding a portfolio and hoping for approval that never came. She'd been terrified of failure, convinced she needed his validation to matter. Somewhere between that day and this one, she'd disappeared, replaced by someone who'd learned that the opposite of his approval wasn't failure. It was freedom. The freedom to build according to different values, to define success in terms that mattered to her, to prove that his way wasn't the only way. The Torres Memorial Tower stood in East Austin, 6 stories of proof that cities could grow without devouring the people who built them. It wasn't the tallest building in Austin. It wouldn't win any popularity contests among developers who measured success by square footage and rental income. But it was mine, and it was hers, and it represented a kind of power that didn't require crushing others to prove itself. That felt like victory enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.